Hello, and you're very welcome to our course on Microsoft Excel 2019 Advanced. My name's Deborah and I'm your instructor on this course. Now, I've been using Excel for over 20 years, and during that time I've used a number of different versions of Excel in my role as a MOS certified IT trainer and Microsoft subject matter expert. I've been involved in a number of large-scale projects that utilize Excel, and Excel is used widely across different industries and business, in particular finance, but Excel has a much wider reach than that. Many people use it at home to help manage household budgets and personal finances also. Now, it is true to say that whilst applications like Google Sheets are becoming more and more popular, Excel is still the most widely used spreadsheet software in the world. And Excel 2019 is the latest on-premise release from Microsoft, and it differs from Office 365 by the way that it's not a subscription offering. Office 2019 is a one-time purchase desktop application for those who haven't chosen to subscribe to Office 365 and who prefer to purchase the software and essentially own the software on their PC. I like to liken it to property. So Office 365 is for renters. You pay a monthly fee to rent the software from Microsoft, and Office 2019 is like purchasing a house. You buy it once and it's yours forever. Now, with that in mind, if you're coming to this course having used Office 365 previously, you're probably not going to notice too much of a difference at all. All of the updates to Excel 2019 have been available in Office 365 for a while. However, if you're coming to Excel 2019 from a much older version, there will be lots of new stuff in this course for you to sink your teeth into. Now, in this first section, I need to cover a little bit of housekeeping. I need to make you aware that this is not a beginner course. This is an advanced course. If you are a beginner in Excel, then you might want to take a look at our beginner's course on our website. If you've used a much earlier version of Excel, let's say before 2007, but you're a pretty advanced user, you probably should still go through at least some of the elements of our basic course to get up to speed with the ribbon and some of the more recent developments in Microsoft Excel. If you are an accomplished user of 2007 or certainly Excel 2010, 2013 or 2016, you probably have a good enough foundation to cover this course. I'm not going to repeat a lot of the basic information in this course, but I will occasionally do a quick summary of what I'm expecting you to know. If I do a quick summary at the beginning of the section and you think to yourself, I didn't know that, you can always go back to the basic course and review the information that you're not familiar with. Now, one important aspect of this is that throughout the life of Excel, many of the basic aspects of it haven't really changed that much. The ribbon was introduced in 2007, but a lot of the basic aspects of what Excel actually does as a spreadsheet package haven't changed a great deal since the very beginning. However, many things have been added, and in areas such as charts and graphs, if you're only familiar with an older version of Excel, you're probably going to be quite amazed at the different types of charts you can build and the things that you can do. Another thing I want to talk to you about is the version of Excel that this course is based on. This course is entirely based on the installed version of Excel 2019 desktop application. Now, as I mentioned previously, Excel 2019 or Office 2019 differs from Office 365 by the way that it's not a subscription. So if you want Excel 2019 or Office 2019, you will need to download it. And I would refer you to this page on the Microsoft support site, which goes through the instructions of how you can actually install Office 2019 on a PC or Mac. And I would pay particular attention to the information that we have in the grey box just here. Another thing I'd like to mention is that this course will be completed almost exclusively using a keyboard and a mouse. We won't be using touch mode at all. Now, touch mode works very well in Excel now on a tablet device, so it might be that you want to work through this course using touch, and that's entirely up to you. The instructions for enabling touch mode in Excel 2019 are basically the same as enabling touch mode in Excel 2016 or Excel 2013, and there is a page on office.com that you can see here explaining how to do this. It only covers Excel 2013, but as I said, it's pretty much the same process for Excel 2019. The last point I need to make here is that although I'm based in the UK, I'm going to be using US locale throughout this course, and this will include not only US dollars as the currency, but also adopting things like US data format and the US spell checker. If you want to work along with me as closely as possible, then you may want to adopt that approach too. However, if you would prefer to use your own locale, your own currency, your own date and time, then you should be able to adapt all of the workbooks that I'm providing you with so that you can work with them using your own settings. Now, as this is an advanced course, I'm going to assume you know where in the settings you need to set these things up. But for example, if I click on language, as I have here, you'll see that I usually work with two languages, English United States and English United Kingdom. For the purpose of this course, English United States is going to be my default. So that's an introduction to the course. I am of course assuming now that you have Excel 2019 installed and ready to use. In the next section, I just need to run through with you the course materials supplied with the course and just explain that in the light of the structure of the course. That's where we're going to next. I'll see you there. Hello again and welcome back to our course. In this video, I'm going to talk a little bit about the structure of the course and give you some important information about how best to follow the course. Now, first of all, this course should ideally be covered in sequence, and I have prepared the course on that basis. However, this is an advanced course, and if you need to cover a topic that's later on in the course right away, there shouldn't be any reason why you can't do that. I've tried to make the parts of the course as standalone as possible, and each of them should have limited reference to earlier parts of the course, but you can go back if you need to. The course is arranged into chapters, and each chapter comprises one or more sections. Each section consists of a single video, and typically a single video is 15 minutes or less in length. Possibly one or two of them are slightly longer, but I try not to go too much over 15 minutes. Now, apart from the videos themselves, there is a folder containing the course files, and this has most of the files that I use during the course, so that if you want to work along with me or try a variation of what I've done, then you have access to those files here. Some of the very small, simple workbooks are not included, but where the workbook has any significant content, I've tried to include it in this folder. I suggest that you make sure you know where your course files folder is and maybe take a backup copy, particularly if you're working along with me. You might break something and need to recover those original files. There's also an exercise files folder. In most cases, this folder includes the starter point for each exercise, as well as my sample answer for the exercise as well. So once again, it's important to know where these files are and take a backup copy of the folder. Now for a couple of important general points. In Excel, there are many ways of doing things, and in order to keep the length of the course not too long, I will show you one or two ways of doing things, but I do appreciate that there are many ways to do the same thing in Excel and alternative methods that you may prefer. So I do suggest that you experiment and find the way that suits you most. Now, there are one or two things that I generally try to avoid, and one of them in particular that you might be surprised by is that I generally don't use keyboard shortcuts. Now, there will be a few instances where I do, and when I do, I will tell you that's what I'm doing. And the main reason I don't use keyboard shortcuts is that you won't see me doing that on the screen. And generally speaking, I like to click something on the screen so you can see me doing it. And I will often highlight or outline where I'm clicking to make it clear. Again, I do appreciate that in many situations you'll probably use a keyboard shortcut instead of clicking on the screen. One other important point, the case studies we're going to be using in this course are very often in quite specialised areas, such as in statistics and finance. Some of these areas might be areas that you're not familiar with, and you might be a little concerned that I will be talking about aspects of these that you really don't understand. Where this might happen, I will try to explain all of the things that you need to know about a particular area or activity in order to demonstrate and understand what's going on. For example, you may not know a lot about finance or statistics, then I'll explain a few key points you need to know in each situation, and hopefully that will make sense in relation to each case study. So that's it. That's the outline to the course structure and a few important points to bear in mind as we work through it. So I think it's time to get started, and we're going to start by taking a look at some general aspects of the use of functions. That's in the next section. I will see you there. Hello again, and welcome back to our course on Excel 2019 Advanced. In this section, we're going to start to look at functions, and we're going to spend quite a bit of time looking at functions as they really do form the backbone of pretty much everything that we do in Excel. Now, functions have been very much the main strength of Excel since the beginning. In Excel 2019, the number of available functions has just about passed the 400 mark, and I can assure you, don't worry, we're not going to be looking at all of them in this course, but we are going to look at quite a few of them. And really, I guess the main problem with functions is the sheer number of them, in that even if you have an idea of the function you want to use, you might not know what it's called or be able to identify easily. So in this first section, I'm going to cover a few of the basics of functions that you might be familiar with, but I'm also going to try to extend that into areas that you may not have used or seen before. I'm also going to talk to you a little bit about how you find what you need and how to identify not only what it does, but how to use it. The first thing I'm going to point out is that there is a really good help topic on functions in Excel 2019 that's a pretty good reference point to find out all the information you need about functions. And here is that help topic, Excel functions by category. Let's go into a particular category like logical functions. And within the list of logical functions, some of the functions have a little year number underneath them. So for example, you can see the if-s function is only available in Excel 2016. If you drill down a bit further into the function by clicking, you'll find a description of what the function does. There will also be some technical details that includes information about the arguments, which ones are required and optional, information about the data types, and so on, and then generally one or more examples of the use of that function. You also get at the bottom sometimes some common problems that you might encounter and typical errors that you get an explanation as to how to correct those errors that may have occurred. So this is all very useful if you're looking for a little bit more information about a specific function. Now, something that isn't mentioned here but is important is that some of the functions in Excel have been improved or advanced, and in some cases give what is usually more accurate results than they used to. So if you have any legacy systems based on Excel or macros, you might find that the results are more accurate than they used to be. There are some other useful links towards the bottom of this page, but there's also a link here to the Excel functions listed in alphabetical order. And there they are. And a couple of other things worth bearing in mind is that you can buy or sometimes get for free functions from third parties. Of course, you could always write your own. Both of these are outside the scope of this course, but are well worth bearing in mind for future reference. What I'm going to do now is a very quick demo of a simple function, and I'm going to point out some of the key features that you're probably familiar with, but possibly a couple of things that you're also not familiar with. So let's start out with a very simple job and just add up these four numbers. If I want to total some numbers, as I do here, I can enter a formula anywhere on this sheet. On this occasion, I'm going to write it directly under the list of 4 numbers. I start with an equal sign, and I'm going to use the sum function. Now, if I hit S, it's going to give me a list of all the functions that begin with S. Now, if I hit U, it narrows that list down to all of the functions that begin with SU. And of course, the one I want on this occasion is sum. So I'm going to select it by double clicking. And you'll see that not only do I get the rest of the name of the function, but I get the first parentheses. And within the parentheses, I'm going to need to enter some arguments. And in the list of arguments, you'll see the bold arguments are mandatory, so I must have at least one number in here. And then the non-bold arguments indicated also here by square brackets are optional arguments. As you can see in the standard definition of the sum function, the arguments are also separated by commas. So whatever the function, even in functions that have no arguments, you'll need to use parentheses. And we'll look at an example of that in a moment. In those arguments, I don't have to put cell references. I could put actual constants. So I could put, for example, sum, and then I could type a 6. And then when I put a comma in, you'll see that Excel is telling me that the next argument is mandatory as it's highlighted in bold. I could then add 8, 10, so on and so forth. And it continues until I close those parentheses. When I've finished entering the argument, I can either hit enter or I can tick the tick on the formula bar. And I'm going to hit the enter key. And I have my total there of 23. The way I have Excel set up is when I hit the enter key, the cursor moves down to the cell below the one where I've just entered the formula. And now you can see the full formula in the formula bar using the sum function and constants. If instead of using constants for the argument, I want to use cell references, so I want to sum the contents of cell D2, D3, D4, and D5, I can use those cell references instead of the constants. So I could enter my formula equals sum, open bracket, select the first cell reference, comma, second cell reference, comma, third cell reference, comma, and then finally, and it's underneath there, the last cell reference, close the parentheses and hit the enter key to give me an answer of 75. So listing the cell references is one possibility. The other possibility, of course, is to specify a range. So instead of listing all of those cells separated by a comma, I could use a range of cells instead. And the way that you can indicate a range is by using a colon between the start cell in the range and the end cell in the range. So let's do this formula again. I'm going to delete it out. And this time we're going to use the range. So equals sum, open bracket, and I'm just going to drag my mouse down to select the range. Oh, hang on, I think I've gone one too far there. So I'm going to make a quick edit, D5, close my parentheses, and hit enter, and I get the same result. Now, I'm not restricted to using values just on this worksheet alone. I have a second range located on sheet 3. Let's go back to sheet 2, and I'm going to double click, and I'm just going to remove my cell range or delete it out. So what I can do now is jump across to sheet 3 and select the cell range just by highlighting E3 to I3. And then if I hit enter, you'll see I get the total of 68. Let's take a closer look at what exactly that function is doing. So if we double click so we can see it, and you can see it gives the sheet name, so sheet 3. It then gives an exclamation point, or a bang as I like to call them. And then it shows the cell range that we've actually selected that's located on that particular sheet. There is also nothing to stop me adding the values in cell range D2 to D5 on this sheet to the values in the range E3 to I3 on sheet 3, which will give me a big grand total. So I'm going to go up to the formula bar this time to edit. And I'm just going to click before where it says sheet 3. I'm then going to highlight cells D2 to D5, put in a comma, and I'm going to click the tick this time instead of hitting enter. And there we go. That gives me a nice answer, all those totals together, of 143. Now, partly because of the flexibility within the use of formulae in Excel, there are rules that you need to stick to, such as you don't have any spaces between function names and parentheses. So if I was just to add one in here by just adding a space and then clicking on the tick to accept it, you'll see that Excel pops up an error. And it says we found a typo in your formula and it's tried to correct it. And I can just double check to make sure that it's corrected it correctly, which in this case it has. And Excel's pretty clever like that. It can normally work out most of the time what you're trying to do and provide you with a suitable correction. So I'm going to say yes to accept this correction, and my formula is working again. Now, I mentioned earlier that even if a function has no arguments, you still need to put it in parentheses. So let's look at an example of that. So for example, I want to work out the value of pi. So I'm going to enter in equals, and I'm going to type pi into my cell. And you can see there, I just want to draw your attention to that screen tip that's popped up. So it says returns the value of pi. And then it gives me that value of pi accurate to 15 digits. If I click on the tick, it will produce an error. So in this case, I'm getting a name error. And you should notice a little marker in the corner there to indicate that there is an error. So if I click it and see what my options are, it's picked up that it's invalid name error. I could also go to help on this error, show calculation steps, ignore error, edit it in the formula bar, or I can go and modify my error checking options. Now this formula contains unrecognized text and it's given me a link through to the invalid name error. So I know that there is a problem with the name. So let's go and edit it in the formula bar. So I'm going to click up here, and this is where I need to add my empty parentheses. So I'm going to add them in like so. And now when I click on the tick, you can see that that formula is now working and it's accurate specifically to the format of that particular cell. The other thing to bear in mind is that you can also nest functions. So if I wanted to add the value of pi to the sum of my numbers over here, I could do that. So I'm going to go up to the formula bar again, and I'm just going to click within my formula at the end there. I'm going to add comma. I'm going to add pi, and I'm going to do my parentheses. And remember, when closing off parentheses, you always need to close as many as you've opened. And now when I hit enter, I have my new total of 146.142. And I could change that by just taking down the decimal places or increasing those decimal places if I wanted to. One other feature which you may have noticed is the use of color coding to make it easier to identify arguments on a worksheet. In this case, it won't be particularly helpful, but later on in some of the case studies, this color coding can make your life so much easier. So let's take a look at it. I'm just going to double click in my cell, and I'm actually going to remove the majority of what I've put in here. Just delete that out. And I'm going to type the cell reference D2. And you'll see it highlights it. So we have a dark blue border with some blue shading. If I do comma D3, you'll see it highlights the next one, and it highlights it in the formula that you're typing and on the actual worksheet. And it will carry on. If I type in D4, we get a highlight in a different color. In the next section, we're going to continue to look at functions in general, but focus on some of the more sophisticated utilities, such as the use of the functions dialog box. So I will meet you there. Hello again and welcome back to our course on Excel 2019 Advanced. In this section we're going to be looking at functions in general, and I want to look first at tools that help you find the functional functions that you need. Now let's take a particular example, and I know that I need a standard deviation function, and that's a statistical function. If you look at the Formulas tab, you'll see the function library group and some of the most commonly used categories of function. So you have financial, logical, text, date and time, so on and so forth. Note also there is a category called recently used, and if you use a fairly restricted set of functions, that's actually quite a good feature because it makes it more likely that the function you want has been used recently, and you can see there the top 3 functions that I've last used. If you look at the other end of the group, there's a More Functions drop down. More Functions gives you access to other categories, and one of them is statistical. The flyout list lists all of the available statistical functions. Now it's worth noting that with each of these, as you hover over them, you'll get a screen tip about that particular function. And underneath that screen tip, there is a link to help. So what you might do, knowing that you need a statistical function, is scroll through the list and try and find the function that you need. Now, if you didn't find it, it might be because you didn't know the name. Now, there is another option, and that is to click on the Insert Function button. The Insert Function dialog here has the category field pre-selected at statistical because I was looking at this before I invoked it. There's another way of invoking the Insert dialog box, and that is where you can invoke it by using the FX button on the formula bar. So once I've invoked the Insert Function dialog box, I have access to the same list of functions, the statistical functions that we were looking at previously. There are a couple of important differences using this dialog. Notice that as I click on each of these functions, I will see an equivalent of the screen tip information underneath. I also have a link through to help on this function. This will open an external window and give me the information that I need about this specific function. Another big advantage of the Insert Function dialog box is that if you don't know the name of the function that you want, you can use the search facility. Now I know I need standard deviation, so I'm going to type into the search box standard deviation and click go. And this brings me up a list of functions that in some way involve standard deviation. The first one is stdev. That's the old standard deviation function, and as you can see there from the text underneath, the list this function is available for is compatible with Excel 2007 and earlier. Then we have the current standard deviation options. This one is for calculating standard deviation on a sample. And we have various other functions for calculating standard deviation. So what I'm going to do here is calculate the standard deviation of numbers in cells A1 to A7. And I'm going to put the result in D4. So let's invoke the Insert Function dialog box. And I'm going to search for standard deviation again. And I know that the one I want to use is this one just here. So now I can see my function arguments dialog, and this is a useful dialog not only because it will remind you of the arguments you need, but it can also help you enter the arguments for the function. So you can not only type arguments in, but you can make selections on a worksheet to form the arguments for the function. The cursor is flashing in the first argument field, and I could type in there the first number from the list. So in this case, the number that we have in cell A1. I could also put lists of numbers or ranges, for example. Note the prompt on the right there that tells me a number is expected, but if, as in this case, the numbers are adjacent, I can also select the range of numbers. And now you can see that my first argument is a range. If I wanted to add a second range, I could put that in as number 2, or I could put a comma in between number 1 and put an additional range in there as well. So it's very flexible. Now the functions argument dialog gives me a preview of the formula result, and I can just click on OK. And there is my standard deviation. Now there is another feature that can be very useful, and that's a feature called Formula Autocomplete. Now, in order for this to work, you need to make sure your options are set correctly. The option you need is on the Formulas page in the Working with Formulas section, second option down, Formula Autocomplete. And as the screen tip shows, it shows a list of relevant functions and defined names when building cell formulas. This functionality can be enabled or disabled by using the keyboard shortcut Alt plus down arrow when in formula editing mode. Now the reason for giving you that straightforward shortcut is that this function can be both helpful but a little annoying as well. So let's suppose that I'm going to put a formula into D4 that's going to involve one of the amortization functions. I can type in equals to start the formula, and as soon as I type in A, I get a list of the functions that start A. You can actually move this little screen tip out of the way just by clicking and dragging if you're finding that a little bit annoying. Now let's say I know it's AM, and I decide it's probably the first one. So when I double click, not only do I get the arguments for that function, but the function itself has a link to a help file with more information on that particular function. This will give me a full explanation of the function and usually some examples, so that can be really helpful if you're trying to work out if this is actually the correct function. Depending on the arguments, as you start to type in the values, so let's say the first value I want is cost, and let's assume it's $3,000. Not only does the next argument in the list get highlighted, but if it's possible, what the Formula Autocomplete will do will offer me options or recognize what I'm typing in that particular argument. Now my next argument is date purchased, and in this case Excel won't be able to recognize which date I'm going to use, but if this was a name I was typing in, it would be able to react to what I was typing to help me identify the name that I want to include. Other than that, I carry on entering my arguments. Remember, optional arguments are in the square brackets, and that's it. That's Formula Autocomplete. Now in these first two sections, I've introduced you or recapped for you some of the key features for using functions in Excel 2019. In the next section, I'm going to look at the Autosum functions, as they have some rather important and unusual features that's worth knowing about. And in subsequent sections of the course, as we use some of these functions, you'll see some of these features I've been talking about in action. But that's it for this section, so I'll see you in the next one. Hello again and welcome back to our course on Excel 2019 Advanced. We've been looking at functions for the last couple of sections, and in this section I'd like to look at the Autosum functions, which you've probably used before but you might not be aware of some of the aspects of their use. Let me show you what I mean. Let's suppose I wanted to add the numbers in column B. Now you might be tempted to select the numbers in column B and then insert the Autosum function as part of the formula in B6, but in fact you don't need to select the numbers first. If you just click below the column and then go up to the ribbon, either the Home tab or the Formulas tab, I'm going to select Home, and the Autosum feature is available on both. So if I click Autosum, you can see that Excel 2019 picks up the numbers listed above, and if I just click the tick to confirm, and I get my total. Now, if instead of doing that, I selected those first 4 cells, and it's worth noting that I haven't selected B6 in this case, and then click on the Autosum button, it gives me the same result. It's also worth noting that if I select cell B2 all the way down to B6 and click on the Autosum button, I get the same result once again. Now let me undo that, so I'm going to click the undo button on my quick access toolbar. Now this time what I'm going to do is select the cells from B6 to C6 and click Autosum. In this case it can sum both of those columns. It puts the formula in B6 for column B and in C6 for column C. Now this doesn't just work for columns. If I wanted to deal with rows, let's click in G2 and Autosum. I get the sum from B2 to F2, so it works on rows as well. Now let's delete the contents of cell F5 and let's look at what would happen if I click the Autosum button. The answer it gives is the sum from F2 to F4. When Autosum has the option of dealing with columns or rows, it always gives precedence to the columns. So you might be interested to see what happens if I select cells B2 to B5 and click on Autosum. Notice the column totals I get. And of course, another way to sum totals that I don't want you to forget about is if we make a selection, so C2 to C5, and use the quick analysis pop-up, we have a totals tab where we can access the sum function as well. So when I click that, you'll see it also puts in my total in cell C6. And what if I select cells B2 to G6 and click Autosum? I get all of the totals, and the 150 in the bottom right hand corner is of course the sum from B6 to F6. Another important point here is that Excel 2019 is pretty good at identifying entities that aren't part of what you're trying to do. So for instance, if in B1 I had a header, so let's pretend that these are figures for different months of the year, and I'm just going to autofill that across. Now if I wanted to sum B2 to B5 by clicking Autosum, that's no problem. Excel realizes that B1 is not part of this and will discard it. In fact, if I select B1 to B5 and click Autosum, Excel 2019 can cope with that as well. The other point I'd like to make here is that so far I've been dealing with sum functions only, but of course the same is applicable if we're doing a count or a min or a max or using one of the other functions. So I'm going to click my Autosum drop down and I'm going to do a count. Excel 2019 makes my selection and I hit enter, and you can see my count is now 4. Let's just try a max as well. And press enter, and there we have our max. Another point to remember here is that in a specific situation, or in fact, if in general you find yourself using a specific function often, so let's say, for example, in this case, max, as it's the one we've just used, you also have the option of adding that to the quick access toolbar, which will make it really, really easy for you to access quickly. And there's a really quick way of doing that. Again, if we go up to the Autosum drop-down, go down to max, right-click and select Add to Quick Access Toolbar. And you can see there by looking at the Quick Access Toolbar, we have this little symbol on the end, and if I hover over, it does a max. So let's just check to make sure that works. And click the icon. There we go, looks great. I'm going to hit Enter. And there we have our max for column D. So that's a few general points about the Autosum family of functions. Now, in the balance of this course, we'll be doing a lot of work with functions and we'll be using quite a few of these general points as well. That's the end of this section. I'll see you in the next one. Hello again and welcome back to our course on Excel 2019 Advanced. In this section, we're going to start to look at date and time functions in Excel 2019. Now, of course, the use of dates and times is fundamental in Excel, but for many people, there are aspects of dates and times that are baffling, confusing, and can cause all sorts of problems. So what I'm going to do in this section is explain in detail how dates and times work, and then look at some of the main functions you're going to need to be familiar with in order to handle any kind of Excel application that requires the use of dates and times. Now, before we begin, let's start with one of the things that I think is the root of many people's problems with dates and times. And that is, ideally you will have the date and time settings on your device set correctly before you even begin. Now, I don't mean by that you have the correct date and time set, but I mean that you have the format set. Although there are some minor differences in how these default settings are handled in the versions of Windows that Excel 2019 will run, fundamentally the approach is the same. You need to start by going to Control Panel and clicking on Region. And you'll get this little dialog box. As I said before, my default language is set to English United States. And in this drop-down, my selection Match Windows Display Language means that my regional settings generally will match English United States. In the drop-down where I could choose a different language to determine the settings, for example, let's scroll down and select English United Kingdom, my short date format will be day, month, year. Whereas if I say, and let's go back to our drop down and scroll back up to the top, Match Windows Display Language, it is of course month, day, year. Now you are probably familiar with what these little D's and big M's mean, but I'll come back to those in a moment. The important thing to realize is that these are my default settings. And if I don't change anything else, if I just insert dates, this determines how they will appear. The same is true of time as well. Now, it may be that in a particular workbook or even a particular cell, I need some different settings, and I'm sure you already know how to change the time or the date format in a cell. But if you find that you're always having to change the short date format and you think, why can't this be the way I want it to be, you almost certainly need to change it in your default settings. Changing the short date format is easy. You can click the drop down and select a short date format. And the same can be done for long date. So there are my defaults. And very importantly, down here we have some additional settings. And these give us settings for time and date. Now, starting with the date ones, there's an example short date and long date. And those are my date formats. Not only can I choose these standard defaults, but I can click in here, like so, and edit this if I want to any combination of the appropriate symbols. And you will see immediately below that there is an explanation of what the notation means. So D or DD is the day number, DDD or DDDD is the day of the week, M is the month, Y is the year, single M will give you a numeric month, long string of M's will give you the words for the month. Also under there is a standard cut-off year, which determines which century is assumed if you enter a 2-digit year. So if I set a year number of 67, it will assume that it's 1967. Now again, you can change that cut-off year if you want to, and you can also change the first day of the week, which I currently have set to Sunday. Note the reset button in the bottom right-hand corner. Now you have a similar set of options for time and an explanation of what those abbreviation symbols mean. Now the first thing you need to do before you start dealing with dates and times is to make sure that you know how these are set and that you are happy with how they're set. And the second thing is that when you are working in Excel, if you're annoyed with the fact that you don't get the right defaults, this is the starting point for setting those defaults. Now, following on from that explanation, you might want to take a look at the help page, either from within Excel 2019, I've brought it up in the side pane just here, or on office.com. And I searched for format to date the way you want. This basically explains how to set date formats, how to set custom date formats, and so on. I'm not covering these formats on this course because I'm assuming you're already fairly familiar with these, but if you do have any uncertainty, then this is a good page to look at. So let's start doing some things with dates and times. Let's put a date in cell F5, and I'm going to put 6/11/78 and hit enter. So that's June the 11th, 1978. Note that because I only entered the 2-digit year, it became 1978 because of that cutoff earlier on. Let's go back into that cell now and change the cell format. So right-click, Format Cells, and I'm going to change it to number format with no decimal places, and click OK. So it now becomes a number 28652. Now this is something that tends to confuse people. A date in Excel 2019 when formatted as numbers is the number of days since the 1st of the 1st 1900. Now when you look at a date on an Excel worksheet, what you're looking at is a representation of a whole number. In fact, times are stored as fractions of a day, so midday on that date would be 28652.5. 6 a.m. would be 28652.25, so on and so forth. One of the things that Excel is pretty good at is recognizing dates and times. If I start with a new cell, so H6, and I'm just going to check the formatting on that cell by going to Format Cells, and I can see that has general formatting applied, so no specific format. So let's put in here 10 org and hit enter. You can see that Excel has looked at that and decided it's probably a date. So it's changed the format of the cell, and we can just double check that. So right click and Format Cells. And you can see here it's selected custom with this format just here, D-MMM. Now if I change this back to general format and click on OK, I can see that Excel has correctly stored that as a date, and that's the number of days in question since the 1st of January 1900. But what about dates and times? Let's put in a time into cell H8 of 10:30, and we'll say AM, and hit enter. Let's check the formatting on that cell, and I can see it's selected custom, and it's selected hours, minutes with that AM, PM marker. But what about if we want to put those two things together? So in cell H10, I'm going to combine the two. So let's say 10 org and enter. Again, Excel has realized it's a date and time. And if I change it to number format, and let's give this quite a few decimal places, and click OK, you can see that it's displaying it as a fraction of a day. However, if I try and put that in a sentence, and hit enter, then Excel will not recognize a date or time combination as part of a sentence. So it's important to understand how dates and times are stored in Excel 2019. And it's also important to understand that Excel will do quite a lot of work in recognizing dates and times, but that the formatting, apart from the default formatting that Excel will use, is largely down to you. And it's important to understand how to use those formatting codes to get dates and times to display the way you want them to. It's also important to understand the various different functions that you can use with dates and times. For instance, you might want to use a function that will tell you a date 60 days from today. Or maybe you want to find a function that will tell you what the time was 2.5 hours ago. These are the types of time and date functions that we're going to be looking at in the next section, so please join me for that. Hello again and welcome back to our course on Excel 2019 Advanced. In this section, we're going to look at some of the most important aspects of using date and time functions in Excel 2019. Now, we're not going to look in detail at formatting. I'm going to assume you're somewhat familiar with formatting, although there will be examples coming up throughout the course, but I want to talk about actual date and time processing first. We've looked at storage in the preceding section, and as a first step in this, I want to look at one of the examples we're going to be developing as we go through the course, and that is the creation of a company invoice. Now let's suppose that I put an invoice date on my invoice. And in fact, there are two dates associated with this invoice. That's invoice date and due date. Now, first of all, one way that we could populate the invoice date field is by using the today function. And the today function, as you would expect, gives the date today. So we just type in equals today. And we have our empty parentheses. So I want you to note that this is one of those functions that doesn't need any arguments. Obviously, I could also change the format if I wanted to. Now, the due date could potentially be a date a certain number of days beyond that date. And one way of doing this would be to say that the due date is 30 days after the invoice date. So how do you find a date 30 days after the invoice date? Well, remember the invoice date will be stored as a number of days. So in fact, all I really need to do here is put a link to cell C2 and plus 30. And we can just do a quick visual check and I can see that that does in fact look correct. As we work through the balance of this course, we're going to continue to develop this invoice, but there are still a few points to make here about dates and times. And the first is that if I click in C2, the definition of the date there is that it is today. Of course, if I was to close this workbook and open it again tomorrow, the date in there would be tomorrow's date, as it's always going to show the current date. Now, what about if you wanted to put in a static date, which may well be the case with something like an invoice? The way you put in a static date is not to use a function. You could either type the date into the cell, or there's a handy keyboard shortcut of Control semicolon, and that will input a static date into the cell. Now, apart from the today function, which gives you the current date, there's also the now function. The now function gives you the time and the date right now. So let's type in equals now. And again, we have our empty parentheses because this is a function that doesn't require any arguments. And you can see there we've got our usual string of hashes, which just means that we need to widen that column ever so slightly and make a bit more room. And there you go. There's also another keyboard shortcut that you could use just to input the current time into a cell, and that's Control Shift semicolon. So it's really worth remembering this point. C2 is dynamic, and D2 is static. So having looked at today and now, let's look at another important function. Let's suppose you're importing some data from another system, and what you have is several dates, such as the one in D7, but they are text dates. How do you make them into dates? For example, so that you can store them as regular dates in Excel 2019. The function you use for that is the date value function. So I'm going to go up to Formulas, and I'm going to go to my Date and Time drop down in my Functions library. And you can see the second one down is Date Value. And as my argument, I'm going to select cell D7 and click OK. So Excel has converted that to a number, so I can just go and apply some date formatting. And I'm going to select the top one, click on OK, and now I have that formatted as a short date. The next set of date and time functions I'd like to look at is a set of 6 functions that can separate out for me the year number, the month number, and the day number, down to the second number of any given date and time. I'm going to use the date in cell D4. Just bear in mind that a minute or two has now passed since D4 was last updated, so it's slightly out of date right now. But if in F4 I use the year function, so again I'm going to go up to my date and time, and it's right at the bottom. I'm going to select year, and I'm going to select cell D4 as my argument, click on OK, and it pulls back 2019. Now when I invoked the year function, what actually happened is cell D4 updates. So you'll see now that the time has refreshed and it is now the current time. Let me do the same for month. So again, up to date and time, and select month. I'm going to use the same cell as my argument, cell D4. And again, watch when I click on OK, you should see that time update. And there we go. Let's fill out the rest of them so I can show you all 6. So we're going to do up to date and time. We're going to do day. Select cell D4 again. And again, you'll see this update. So those 6 functions can be used to isolate the year, month, day, hour, minute, and second. Any change made to cell values anywhere on this sheet will cause that value to be updated. So if I was just to add a 1 in here, you'll see when I hit enter, everything will refresh. And there we go. And hopefully you saw that minute changed just there. Now I've already shown you how to get a date from a text date, but there is another way that you can build dates as well. And in fact, you can use a similar approach for times, and that is to use the date function. And what the date function does is to build a date from 3 constituent parts. Now what I'm going to do is first invoke the date function. So again, let's jump up to date and time, and date is the top one. So I'm going to choose a year number, so let's say 2018. I'm going to say the month 11 and the day 10, and click OK. Now I don't have to use constant values for those arguments. I could in fact use values from other cells on the worksheet. So for instance, instead of 2018, and I'm just working up in the formula bar now, I'm going to double click, I'm going to delete it, and I could say take the year and then specify a cell reference. So I'm going to select cell D4 and close my parentheses. I'm going to do the same for month. So let's delete that out and take it from D4. And then finally, we're going to say day and take that from D4 like so. And there we go. Our answer in D11 replicates what we have in D2, which is correct. Now, what about if I wanted to add 30 days to the date in D11? Well, all I need to do is click just before that last parentheses and click plus 30 and hit enter. And there we go. And we can just do another visual check and I can see that yes, that looks like it's 30 days. And I can just do a visual check and I can see that yes, this new date in D11 is 30 days beyond the date in D2. So we've looked at some very important date and time functions in this section. There are 2 or 3 others I need to go through with you, but we're going to cover those in the next section. I've saved this workbook into the course files folder as date functions 1 in case you want to go in and have a little play around with it. So I will see you in the next section. Hello again and welcome back to our course on Excel 2019 Advanced. In the preceding section, we looked at some of the basic functions associated with working with dates and times, and in this section, we're going to look at 2 or 3 of the more advanced, more complex functions that I think you will also find useful. Before we do that though, I did mention that when it comes to building dates from individual components, there is an equivalent set of facilities for time. So just as a way of demonstrating this, let's run through a quick example. Now in cell B2, I have the current date and time. If I wanted to add 12 hours to that, all I would need to do would be to write equals B2 plus 0.5 and hit enter to confirm. And I can do a quick visual check and look and see to make sure that that is correct, which it appears to be. Note that whenever I update something on the sheet, the value of now is updated also because it's dynamic. Now suppose I wanted to add a much more unusual amount. So for example, say 3 hours and 23 minutes. Well, ideally, what you want to do is add 3 hours and 23 minutes to the date and time in B2. So let's type in equals B2 plus, now this time I can use the time function. And you can see my arguments underneath, so I can type in the hour, which is 3, comma, the minute, which is 23, comma, and then the second, which is 0. And close off my parentheses. And I can either hit enter, this time I'm going to click the tick to confirm, and there we go. And again, I can do a quick visual check and compare F2 to B2, and I can see that yes, roughly that time looks roughly around 3 hours and 23 minutes after. So as you can see, we have the equivalent functions that we have for building dates. Now, so far we've been looking at dates with no regard for working days and non-working days. Sometimes working days are very important. So for instance, you might give someone 30 working days to pay as opposed to 30 calendar days. Now there is a function in Excel 2019 which is the workday function. And the workday function can calculate the number of work days from a given date, either in the future or in the past, and it has an added very useful facility where it can take into account holidays as well. In the first instance, I'm going to demonstrate it without the use of holidays. So I'm going to click in cell D4 and I'm going to use B4 as my starting date, and I'm going to look for a date which is 30 working days beyond the date in B4. So the function I need is workday. So let's jump up to date and time and select workday, and we get our function dialog box. So start date, that's nice and easy. We're going to select B4, and then we need to specify the amount of days. So in this case, 30. And as I said, we have a third argument we could complete for holidays. We're not going to do that just at the moment. We will do that in a second. And click on OK. And again, if I do a quick visual check, and you can check this yourself if you want to make sure that it's correct, that is roughly 30 working days in advance of the date in B4. Now let's take a look at this holiday feature. If you have a number of holidays, so for example, public holidays, work holidays, etc., then you can define those as a list of dates, and Excel 2019 will take those into account when it's doing its calculations. Now on this occasion, I'm going to put in a few assorted holiday dates or vacation days. Now one of the holidays where I live is the August bank holiday, and I've also included the Labour Day holiday for good measure. So let me go back to my formula in D4. Let's edit the formula by jumping up into the formula bar and just clicking before the last parentheses, and I'm going to add an additional argument. So if I do comma, it now highlights that third argument, the holidays argument. So all I need to do now is tell Excel where my holiday dates are. So I'm going to select my range F4 to F5 and hit enter to confirm. And you can see that mine's jumped forward a little bit more than that, taking account the weekend. So it's actually brought it across into the next week. Now, the other thing about the workday function is that you can have a negative value for the number of days. And if I change this to a negative value, so minus 30, and hit enter, it will give me 30 working days before. We're going to look now at something else you might have to do from time to time, and that's to find the difference between two dates. Now that sounds like it could be quite straightforward, but there are a couple of interesting quirks to be aware of. So let's start by finding the difference between the date in B7 and the date in D7, and we're going to find out first of all how many years are between those dates. Now one way of doing that is using the year function. And if you look up in the formula bar, you'll see the function that we're doing there. So essentially we're taking the year from D7 and minusing the year from B7. And when I click the tick to confirm, we get an answer of 1. Now you may look at that and say, well, that's not a whole year. What Excel is actually doing is looking at the year number in one date and then the year number in the other date and taking the difference between them. It's not really looking at how many totally elapsed years there are between those two dates. There is an alternative approach to this, and that is to use the date diff function. And this function is designed to show you the difference between two dates. Now, one of the quirks with date diff is that you won't find it listed in the function library. So if you look under date and time, you won't find the date diff function, and you won't find it if you explore the wider function library either. So you need to type it directly into the cell. So equals date diff, open parentheses. The first argument is the start date. So in this case, B7, comma. The second argument is the end date, so D7, comma, and then we need to tell Excel what we want it to extract. So in this case, we're doing the year. Close parentheses. So that's the date diff function, and you can see it says that there are 0 years. So essentially, finding the difference using years is rounding up, and finding the difference using date diff is rounding down, because there is not one full year according to date diff. Let's now turn our attention to the number of months between those dates. And first of all, in G8, I'm going to use the month function. So up to the formula bar. And I could use this combination of functions. So month D7 minus month B7. Click the tick to confirm. So if we just look at our months, you can see that 7 minus 4 is actually 3, so minus 3 in this case. So let's see how that works using our date diff function again. Up to the formula bar. Date diff, open parentheses, B7, comma, D7, comma, and then we're going to specify the month this time and close our parentheses. Hit enter to confirm. And now you can see we have the correct answer of 8. If you count from July 2016 to April 2017, then that will give you an answer. There are 8 months in between. Following on from that, the next question might be, what is the number of days between those two dates? And in H9, as you can see, I've already put in the datediff function for the number of days. However, for days, there is a much simpler way of doing things. We can simply do equals D7 minus B7. Hit enter to confirm, and you'll see we get exactly the same as the result using the datediff function. Now the datediff function does a pretty good job, but there may be occasions when you want to do something which is a little bit outside the scope of what datediff is able to do. And it's very useful to be able to manipulate functions like year, month and day. Now we've seen quite a few of these date and time functions, I will leave you to read up on some of the ones that we haven't covered in this section. So you can refer to the help feature in Excel and just look for date and time functions, and you will see all of them listed here. Some useful ones I'd like to highlight: the days function, and you can see here that that is available in Excel 2013 and onwards. Some other functions that I want to draw to your attention that might be worth checking out are the network days function and also the networkdays.intl function. Both of those help you work out the whole work days between two dates. So as an additional little exercise, you might try to set up a calculation of the net number of working days between B7 and D7 on the worksheet on the Data Functions 2 workbook. Now, as we go through the course, we will be referring to dates and times and the associated functions. But now it's time to turn our attention towards text functions. That's what we'll be looking at in the next section, so I'll see you over there.